Yeah, we have our next presentation on plastic food environment by Yates from the Academy of Agriculture, Nutrition and Health. Joe, go ahead.
Thanks very much, Phyllis. Thanks very much, Phyllis and Amos, for putting together such an exciting program. My name's Joe Yates. As Phyllis said, I'm based at the Agriculture, Nutrition and Health Academy at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, and it's really our pleasure to be as the ANH Academy partners in this event. So thanks again, for inviting us to take part and for giving us an opportunity here to talk about something which is perhaps not necessarily traditionally discussed in the context of food environments, but something that's just some ideas that we've got from recently looking at the issue of plastics that we'd like to sort of discuss here today. And really the idea is just to present some results from a recent scoping review we've done on food system plastics to try and conceptualize some of these, the evidence that we've found or some of the lack of evidence through a food environment lens, and then to maybe start a conversation about joining the dots between research communities and staying in touch. So why do we think this is relevant for food environments? Well, I think everyone will be aware that plastics are very widely used across linear food systems, and they do present a vast range of benefits and harms. Waste management systems, for instance, across African countries vary significantly, and therefore the impacts of plastic, particularly pollution, varies as well. We know that recent estimates suggest that inadequately managed waste, that is waste that is not properly managed into recycling or closed loops, ranges vastly between different African countries, as I say, but an average among them is around 74%. And we know that also that the informal economy plays a really important role in many settings, and often it's the poor and marginalized who do a lot of the work in repurposing packaging. And in South Africa, there was some evidence to suggest that up to 80% of packaging is repurposed in some settings. But there's pretty significant health impacts and safeguarding impacts that go along with that, safety impacts, I mean. And it should be said that some African countries, Rwanda, for instance, Kenya, have implemented very early on, in relative terms to the globalized trends, plastic bag bans, for instance. And so there's evidence coming out there which can inform and tell us a lot about what can work around the world. We know that public-private policies are now taking shape, and marketing and social norms are really beginning to kick off around plastics, but we are concerned that perhaps this isn't well evidenced. And perhaps food environment lens can help us better understand this. So a few words quickly about the plastic problem. I don't think I need to say too much here. Most people will be keenly aware that plastics are being produced and used at a rate which is far more manageable than any waste management system in any part of the world, really, to be honest. And in the African context, a pretty staggering amount of plastic has been imported since 1990. By one estimate, it's over 170 million tons of the stuff has been imported. And a recent study that came out in a Nature journal suggested, rather worryingly, that even under the best case scenario C here at the bottom, which is a sustainability scenario to reduce plastic use and improve waste management, there's a stubbornly high amount of plastic across the continent. And more worryingly is that a lot of it, or most of it, is due to be not adequately managed for one reason or another. And so to the food systems now, and the role of the food systems in the plastic problem. We know that plastics are used widely in agricultural production, at processing, storage and transportation, in the retail sector, which is where many plastics first enter the food environment and people interact with them, and that mediates behavior around food choices. And of course, at consumption level, and also plastics are used themselves at the waste disposal level of food systems. We've adapted this food systems from the FAO and from Turner et al. And the ANH Academy Working Group on Food Environment. So about 3 years ago, we conceived the idea to try and understand what exactly is going on with plastics in the food system, where they're used, and with what effects. So we set ourselves the task of looking for the last 20 years worth of evidence, quantifiable evidence. So this is an important distinction to make now, because a lot of the evidence on food environments we believe is probably qualitative, especially around consumer preference and things like that, which is partly why it's a really interesting and fortunate to be able to talk to you all today to understand what you might think about this. But essentially, we try to understand what is the extent, range, and nature of the evidence out there relating to food system plastics, and whether there's evidence or gaps in evidence where we need to focus our attention. We set our review up along this logic diagram model. And so we had plastic used. There's different types of plastics. If you're not familiar, I can tell a little bit about that in a second. But any type of plastic of the conventional plastics used, any stage in the food system, a linear food system, we would consider. And we wanted to find outcomes that were relevant to human health, food security, economics, and the environment. And just to give you a sense of the different levels that we were looking at both intermediate outcomes and final outcomes. So we would see, for instance, if a plastic used at any point in the food system was having an impact on the nutrient content or the properties of a foodstuff, then we would consider that on the pathway towards human health, assuming that would be eaten by humans. But we were also looking for final outcomes, and that they are changes measured among human populations, for instance, changes in disease states. And so the same sort of logic is applied for food security and economics, where we'd, for instance, consider yields as on the pathway, but outcomes would need to be measured in food security indicators. So a quick word on the types of plastic. I won't say much on this, but many of you will have looked on the bottom of bottles before and seen the signs. There's various groupings. These are the 7 sort of main groupings. Conventional plastics. There's lots of new bio-type plastics coming out now or in development. But these have dominated since the 1950s. And it's important because they have different properties, different chemicals go into them, different ways of recycling them, and capacities for recycling. So what did we find? It was almost 50,000 records that we looked at after duplicates, and we included almost 3,500 in total in our review. And essentially, what we found is that the evidence base is growing rapidly, as to be expected, particularly in the last few years. We found evidence base dominated almost 50% by high-income countries, and very, very little from low-income settings. And that was quite concerning to us, because low-income settings are where a lot of the plastic growth is due to happen, and where obviously a lot of the mismanaged waste and waste management capacities aren't quite there yet, which is quite a concern. We found that a lot of the evidence, over 75% of the evidence, captured outcomes that we would consider to be relevant to food security or household economics. Almost half of the evidence captured outcomes that we would consider to be related to human health, and just under 10% actually related to the environment, which was a sort of counterintuitive finding. I'm not going to go into great detail here about the findings. I think if you've got time to explore them, that we've got an interactive area on our site, you can do that, and I'll show you in a minute. But essentially, one of the things that we found interesting was that there wasn't much evidence here at, around the food environment area. So where prepackaged food and drinks, retail storage, takeaway in particular, we didn't find much evidence, or hardly any, in fact, measured among human populations, or even at the food and drink level, the product itself. We found quite a lot on the food and drink, on the product around prepackaged, but not once it entered into sort of retail and takeaway. And also in terms of food security indicators, we found next to nothing that looked actually used a food security indicator or adapted one to look at how plastics might be mediating those outcomes. And some of what we didn't find, we believe, is because of the design of our study, but also some of it may be due to the fact that we weren't looking at qualitative data as well, which seems to be important. So this is the online evidence and gap map. If you've got time or you're interested, please do go to the website at the bottom of the page and have a look. There's a lot of information on there. We ourselves are kind of we haven't been able to sort of really engage at a sort of granular level. So if you find anything interesting, we'd love to hear about it as well. Why is this important for the food environment? And this really is just now, this section is really just some ponderings, to be honest, that we've been thinking about, and we're really, as I say, feel really fortunate to be able to bring it to a group of experts like you all to sort of hear what you think. So basically, as we've just discussed, plastics are used throughout the many stages of food systems, at least food systems that are presented in a linear fashion like this. But we don't quite know, or we don't think there's been a good synthesis out there that explains how plastics mediate food choice and food choice behaviors. And this is what we're interested in perhaps looking at now. So we have taken the framework from Turner and colleagues, and we have tried to sort of put some loose ideas against some of these constituent parts. So on the left-hand side, production, storage, transformation, transportation, we've added some of the sort of distal or proximal ways in which plastics impact the food system. For instance, at production, we know that plastics have been used in vast amounts to cover fields and row covers and mulching, and the outcomes related to that can be relevant to yield, productivity, and mediating resources. So on peripheral to the food environment, that we think that can probably affect availability and things like that. It's also food safety and preservation at the processing and storage stage, and also transportation. Plastics have prevailed because they're light and they're durable, are lightweight and durable and very flexible. But once we're in the food environment domain, especially in the external domain, there is some pretty solid evidence, I think, out there. For instance, availability. We know that water sachets and bottles in many places in low-income contexts can fill critical infrastructure and service gaps. We don't know really, I don't think we really know the balance of trade-offs across those things. Obviously, they have environmental issues, but if you were to remove them all, as some people, on the sort of more extreme fringes are calling for, then what would that do to water security? We know that prices could be probably affected by plastics because, as I say, they're cheap, they're lightweight, they're durable. They can reduce costs for transportation and reduce energy inputs, if you're moving things around. And that is linked to also the vendor and product properties. And of course, plastics have played a very important role in food preservation, safety, and nutrient quality. But a big concern I think that we would have, and is a growing concern in the research community, is the cumulative effect, toxicity and leaching of plastics into foods, which I think has been explored, but in silos, and it's not really joined up with, especially with our food and nutrition security, I don't believe, adequately. Another area which is interesting, I think, is the whole marketing and regulation aspect. Plastic is very useful. It's a very let's say it's a skin for advertising to be printed onto in a very effective way. It can be used. Perhaps does it help with the promotion of ultra processed foods? Does it also now? There's this whole narrative around being more eco-friendly and plastics being recycled. Is that making people make decisions about certain food choices? There's a couple of question marks we have ourselves, and again, this is in coming to this group, we hope perhaps the conversations that follow might help us to understand these things about accessibility and affordability in the personal domain. But we think probably there's quite a big role that plastics play in convenience, especially around fast food. Again, question marks around ultra processed foods, and a single-use disposable on the go. So that seems to be important for convenience. And of course, desirability. We've seen that definitely in the COVID era that things wrapped in plastic are perceived to be more hygienic and of higher quality, and perhaps more trustworthy if they come with a brand that people recognize. But also there's a growing evidence base to show that people are concerned about buying things wrapped in plastic. And so as we come to the fringes of the food environment, and where it comes out the other side into like informing people's actual acquisition and consumption, there's some big question marks that we have here. And ultimately, what we're all hoping to understand, isn't it, is what the health and nutrition outcomes are of these kind of things. A quick word here on the broader impacts of plastics, and I think it's useful for this conversation. This is borrowed from my colleague Megan Deeney, who's doing her PhD on the life cycle effects of single-use packaging. So single-use packaging is clearly a big intersects with the food environment in a major way, but the life cycle of single-use packaging is really interesting. If you think about most plastics are produced from fossil fuels. The raw material extraction of those has impacts for emissions and climate change. When they're refined and manufactured, that creates air pollution issues, particularly for communities living around those areas. So that's linked to respiratory health impacts. At the retail and consumer use, you can see that there could be health impacts related to leaching and endocrine disruption. And of course, there's issues with waste management and pollution in all areas of the world. And so circular economy strategies are trying to close some of these loops. But we wonder whether they are truly evidenced in a way which takes into account the broad range of overlapping trade-offs, particularly for nutrition and health. So I thought I'd spend the last part of this, I've done a lot of kind of speculation up to now. So I thought I'd spend just a minute or two looking at some illustrative evidence. This is by no means exhaustive. It's just some cherry picking from stuff that we've seen that is relevant. Obviously, a big phenomena across the African continent is the expansion of supermarkets. And there's some quite strong evidence from different parts of Africa, in particular in Kenya and in South Africa, that points towards supermarketization of Africa and this impact on obesity. But what we would also say is, what is the role of plastic in here? We don't yet know at that level whether there's a sort of role for plastic, but we know that there's definitely a relationship between these two things. Back in 2012, Claire Relton and Mark Strong and Michelle Holdsworth, who I've seen, I think, on online today. Michelle pondered whether plastic food packaging encourages obesity. I think that's a really important question that is probably yet to be fully answered even, and something that we'd be really interested in understanding. In terms of people's perceptions around using plastic, there was a quite a big social scientific review looking at how people behave towards their food choice decisions when it comes to plastics, and it did seem to indicate that habits and norms and situational factors are pretty strong and prevailing. And as you can see, there was evidence from all corners of Africa in that study, but still some gaps. If you read that paper, you can see where exactly they are. There was an interesting study on drivers of single-use plastic in Ghana that we looked at, particularly with regard to packaged water. And again, sadly, it looks like bottled water is due to continue to rise across the region. But I was really interested to hear Selefina's talk earlier about, and I'd be interested to know more about the waste management initiatives that are going on in Accra. Because again, back to the trade-offs, if people don't have infrastructure and access to water, then bottled water plays a really important role. And it's just whether those environmental trade-offs can be sort of addressed as well. There was another important study that came out this year with regards to young people and their attitudes and their practices around plastics and how they were using them. And are people really aware that plastics can be dangerous and can lead to health outcomes if they're used in particular ways? And this evidence seems to suggest that knowledge wasn't there. I want to tell you a quick thing about this transition towards circular economies. It's not as simple as it seems. Pepsi are out there telling us that recycled bottles taste better than ever, but on the other hand, we've got whole groups of scientists who are definitely very concerned about food contact materials and toxicity. So we need to be looking at the evidence in a more holistic way, I think. And also, who's responsible ultimately, for making these decisions? Can we put it all on the consumer, or do we need to start thinking more about the actors that are pushing these products onto people? And we've got a paper coming out in the next month that looks at trust and responsibility And this is again something that that came up earlier, and it was great to hear Pimen's thoughts on that particular issue. So I'll just about kind of finish up in a second, but the last thing I want to say is that there's a very fast-moving policy environment, public sector, public-private environment. Circular economies and circular food systems are the future, but we are sort of quite concerned that these policies need to be evidence-based, and the evidence needs to come from across the myriad sort of domains of interest. So, in summary, food systems are major consumers of plastics, and they're set to continue to be. We're concerned about the policies and programs that they may not be evidence-based, and we really think that food environments research can help to guide some of these policies in a more meaningful way. And we'd love to hear from anyone in this network today or going forward about any ideas you have, and open to possible collaborations and discussing further. So I'll finish up there, and just to say thanks to the funders who are involved in our program and all the many collaborators who have been involved in this work stream. So thanks a lot.